So I kind of have a Halloween tree. And it's amazing. And when I was putting the tree up, I decided to go with a Monster Mash theme because I love all things vintage horror film. And I just happen to be the proud owner of three styrofoam monstery heads. Let me show you what I did with them. So, starting with those styrofoam heads and some cheesecloth and liquid starch, I placed the cheesecloth over the heads and then pressed it into place with the liquid starch. My liquid starch brand of choice is Stay Flow. I've been told it's hard to find, but in the bigger grocery stores, I haven't had any issues with finding it in the laundry aisle. Again, it's the liquid starch, not the spray stuff. I covered the head completely with a couple of layers of the cheesecloth just to give it a more textured look. I always place it in front of a fan to help it dry. When that was complete, then I took it outside because, let's be honest, I'm a messy painter. And if I do it outside, it's kind of guilt free. I took it outside and painted all of these heads completely black. This is going to give it a really rich surface for me to paint on. Again, I let these dry either in front of the fan or outside. Now, this guy, let's talk about him because he was a little bit tricky, not gonna fib. I mean, once I had him painted black, I then went over him with some red and then this kind of yellow ochre color, and he just looked like a zombie to me. I was really wanting him to look like a mummy, but I thought, I guess he'll just have to be a mummy slash zombie. It wasn't until I kind of shared it with my husband that he had the idea that I should perhaps wrap it like a mummy. Great idea. But I do have to say, I love the way that the face really looks once you've gone over it with a dry brush. All of the texture from the cheesecloth really stands out. And I also think that painting it or having the cheesecloth on the surface first really helps make the paint stick to the styrofoam. I was a little fearful that if I didn't cover it with cheesecloth and a couple of coats of paint, that perhaps the paint would start to chip off. Once these three layers of paint dried, then I decided to go ahead and start wrapping it with cheesecloth strips. So for that, I used my cheesecloth again, and I'm not even going to stretch the truth. I used my cold cup of coffee. I'm not above being a little bit raunchy and gross when it comes to my crafting, okay? The coffee was cold. I may or may not have continued to drink out of it. I don't need to disclose that information to you. I will say this, coffee does a great job of staining the cheesecloth. As soon as I kind of squeezed all of the excess water out, I dipped it once again in the starch, squeezing that out also, and just kind of layered it over the mummy face. It really took my little monster head from looking like a crazed zombie to looking like a crazed mummy, which was exactly the look I was going for. It was kind of tricky for me to figure out exactly where I wanted the bandage strips to go. I wanted enough of the face to show to make it interesting, but yet to make it mysterious enough to hide parts of it. So that part did take a little bit of thought, but the good news is that once you place the cheesecloth on there, it doesn't adhere right away like a plaster strip. So I was able to keep placing things, moving things around, and really rearranging it till I got it right. In fact, when I did place the cheesecloth down, I made sure not to press it completely tight and flat. I wanted the bandage strips to have a little bit of a look as though they were falling off the mummy's face. Quite the handsome devil, I know. Now, when you do place this in front of a fan, make sure you do rotate it so all of the water from the starch doesn't just sit and pool in one part of your sculpture. And voila, mummy complete. He's actually my favorite just because of that creepy, weird, mysterious factor. After having done the exact same thing with my Dracula, covering it with cheesecloth, giving it a couple of layers, letting it dry, and painting it completely black, then I went over it with a dry brush. This was a little bit tricky for me because I had to really think about a couple of layers of paint. After painting in blue, I realized, you know what? I didn't need a blue vampire in my life. So then I had to let that dry and add another color on top. I like to work when I'm doing this kind of dry brush thing from a really dark color and then gradually bringing it up to light. In fact, the more colors that you add when you're doing this technique, the more rich and more depth your project's going to have. So once the blue was dry on the face, I did go back over it with a lighter color of blue, which I have to say I was much happier with that color. Same with the little collar that the vampire had. By the way, in case you're wondering, I found all 3 of these styrofoam heads at Joann's, although I'm sure you could probably find them online. And right now, everything seems to be dirt cheap because Halloween is quickly approaching. I got these actually last year after Halloween was over and just kind of kept them in my stash because that's what hoarders do. And I'm a really good hoarder. After I was done going over the surface with kind of broad strokes, then I was able to go back with a smaller brush and work on details like the teeth and the blood red lips. I did have to be kind of careful because I didn't want my vampire to go into crossdresser land. I mean, not that there's anything wrong with that. That just wasn't exactly the look that my vampire and I were going for. But it was really fun to get the teeth painted in. Right now, he's got the hillbilly look with only a couple of teeth. But I will say he is kind of one of my favorites on the tree, although his piercing and angry gaze always kind of stops me dead in my tracks when I walk by my tree. Once these guys are complete, there's no need to cover them with a Mod Podge or a sealer if you're using acrylic paint. Acrylic paint already has that shine to it, so there's no need to coat it. However, if you're using a different kind of paint, one that's a little bit more muted or could possibly chip, you might want to go ahead and coat your project with a Mod Podge. Just keep in mind that there are a large variety of Mod Podges. Some of them have a little bit of a shine to them. Some of that you might not want. So take that into consideration when you're picking up your different sealers. Ah, yes, quite the handsome devil. Now, I did not film myself working on Frankenstein. He was actually the first one that I made, and I wasn't exactly sure if what I was doing was going to turn out, so I didn't film it. But he was the easiest one of them all, and he looks pretty good. All I did, again, cover it completely with cheesecloth, paint the whole thing black, and all I did for him was go over him with green and a little bit of silver for the bolt sticking out of his neck. Like I said, he was the easiest. By the way, cheesecloth isn't always the easiest thing to find. I have found, however, if you go into larger grocery stores, you can usually find it in the cooking section. I found a really good stash of it actually in my craft store right next to where these styrofoam heads were. Go figure. So there you have it. That's kind of my amazingly frightening vampire. So let's fast forward a little bit and see what these bad boys look like when they're all finished up. Now, before I thought about putting these guys on my tree, I actually had them in display in large jars, and I have to say they looked really good and really spooky. Perfect for Halloween. Thank y'all so much for letting me share this spooky and relatively easy craft with y'all.